Good morning and welcome to day two of our Democracy in Danger. The ground rules will be pretty much the same as last week. Again, this course is lecture only, so I have distributed the 4x6 cards where you can write any question you think of and deposit it in the manila envelope at the back of the room. So I did have a couple questions from last week, so let me turn to those. First question was, how do we curtail the intolerance and hatred that is occurring so openly in our society? As we continue through this course, you'll see there is no easy answer to this question because this unpleasant stew we find ourselves in has been cooking for quite a long time. So many forces beyond our individual control, demographic changes, the rise of social media, the fears of our rural and Christian neighbors, economic inequality, the erosion of democratic norms, have all led us to this point where civility to each other has become extremely difficult. All I can suggest is that you not be part of the problem. Can you be tolerant of the intolerant? Can you be kind to the hateful? That may be all we can do until this fever passes. And be optimistic that this fever will pass. We've been through this before during the Civil War and also when the forces of US fascism were on the march in the first half of the 20th century. So the second question, how do we deal with the anti-democratic forces within our society? This course is designed to help you recognize those forces that tear at our democracy. Hopefully, this will help you stand up against those forces that are unhealthy. But at a minimum, we as voters must be prepared to recognize those who have an anti-democratic bent and be willing to reject them, even if we like their positions on the issues. We must reject those candidates who do not accept the results of free and fair elections, meaning those who do not consistently and unhesitatingly accept defeat. And we must reject those who do not unambiguously renounce violence and the threats of violence as a means of political change. If the game of democracy is to continue, any candidate running for office must commit to democratic values as an entry-level concern before we even hear about their positions on the issues. So there was a comment that said the gatekeeping function seems unknown or weak. And this is exactly right. And we'll be talking about it on day 3. So I'm not going to say any more about that here. So just stay tuned. So let's review a little bit. Last week, we talked about the value of democracy and provided some comparison to authoritarian forms of government. Democracy is unique because it is the people who are to be the ultimate authority and not some individual or elite group. Then we talked about the elements or components that define a democracy, such things as voting rights and liberties, constitution, the peaceful transfer of power, and the rule of law. But even with a constitution, it is not enough because you cannot make up enough rules to govern every situation. What is required is accepted norms of appropriate behavior. We talked about the importance of tolerance, that is, accepting your opposition as rivals and not enemies. Forbearance, which is using the legal power at your disposal judiciously. Gatekeeping, which is screening out those who would subvert a democracy. And a widespread belief in the legitimacy of democracy. We talked about how democracies are subverted and how it typically happens from within through capturing the referees, sidelining the opposition, and changing the rules of the game. And finally, we learned that politicians must do 3 things to be considered loyal to democracy. They must respect the outcome of elections, reject violence and the threat of violence, and break with those who represent anti-democratic forces. Today, we will begin with reviewing our democracy, and we start with voting rights and electoral legitimacy. and then we will cover money and politics. The rest of these will be covered in the following weeks. So democracies are typically subverted from within, and we need to be aware of this as we begin to review the various elements of our democracy and how they are holding up under the politics and pressures of modern society. Let's look at these elements and see how things are changing. As we identify problems, I will not be saying much about what should be done. I'm simply trying to make you aware of the friction points that are impacting our ability to maintain a functioning and sustainable democracy. The most fundamental element of a democracy is a system of voting. If democracy is ruled by the people, then it is essential that there be a system for determining the will of the people. In all democracies, that will be determined by the elections and voting. So let's look at that first. If you remember from last week, one of the philosophical underpinnings of democracy is that we believe that all human beings can be trusted to successfully decide things for themselves, both individually and in groups. Every person is deserving of the respect that they know what is good for them and should be able to act accordingly, including voting their interest. But in the United States, we are still struggling mightily over the issue of whether we really want every person to vote. Is voting the right of every citizen, or is it a privilege of those who qualify? Are there citizens who should be discouraged from voting? The video talked about felons not voting. What about people who find it too difficult to get to the polls? What about people without an official ID? What about the mentally ill? How about people who are not well informed? What about people who just do not care? If we see voting as a right and support that idea by making it easy to vote, is there a risk that unqualified people are voting? Does easy voting open up the potential for fraud? And if we make some effort to screen out certain voters, that is, only allow a certain privileged set of voters, will some of our citizens not be properly represented? Will their voices not be heard? The Declaration of Independence states that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. This means that the legitimacy of democratic leadership stems from reflecting the will of the voters. But what if only half the citizens vote? What if we find that certain segments of populations are not represented fully in the voting totals? Will we be able to claim our election as a legitimate reflection of the will of the people? This is a problem we face as a country. As you saw in the video, typically only about 55% of our voting age population is participating in our elections, and we stand somewhere around 30 out of 35 countries when it comes to voter participation. If widespread voter participation is a sign of democratic health and legitimacy, it would seem we should be finding more ways to encourage voter participation. In other countries, voting is seen not just as a right, but as a citizen's duty, similar to jury duty. There are 23 countries who make it legally compulsory to vote. Not that penalties are significant or even enforced, but clearly they are stating a national value that voting is your duty as a citizen. But in the US, it's not making voting a duty that has risen to the top of the national agenda. It's worries about election fraud. As a consequence of the 2020 election, around 30% of American society has lost confidence in the integrity of our election system. That frustration boiled over when a large contingent of those folks showed up in Washington to stop the electoral count certifying Joe Biden's victory. The consequences of so many people believing our electoral system is illegitimate are enormous. If true, our electoral system is in desperate need of repair. If not true, that must be said clearly because such false charges
corrode our democracy and leave a significant share of the population doubting the legitimacy of our system and seriously weakening the country. To have 30% of the country lack faith in election results based on charges of cheating, stolen elections, and fraudulent ballots is not sustainable in a democracy. What makes this really problematic is no credible evidence has emerged that there was anything wrong with the 2020 election. The Trump campaign brought over 60 court cases alleging fraud, but they lost every single case because no fraud was ever proven. The Justice Department, the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Election Assistance Commission all investigated and found no fraud. At least 8 members of Trump's inner circle all testified under oath to the January 6th Commission that they investigated every lead of fraud that Trump brought to their attention and found nothing. Most recently, several longtime Republican insiders published a report titled Lost, Not Stolen, investigating all the fraud claims and concluded there were none. Even Trump himself paid 2 firms $1.3 million to investigate voter fraud in 2020 and quietly buried both reports when neither firm could prove any fraud. Certainly, there were cases of illegal voting that were discovered and prosecuted. We were talking hundreds of individuals against 155 million voters, so nothing that would affect the election outcome. Many thought that the unproven 2020 election fraud claims would fade away into the background as time passed, but that has not happened. In spite of audits and other post-election reviews, election disinformation continues to spread. The myth of a stolen election has become an article of faith for certain voters. That belief is motivating those individuals to take action against those officials and systems seen to be part of the stolen election. Thus, many election officials are spending much of their time that should be devoted to registration, early voting processes, etc., for the 2024 election, preparing for disinformation and its consequences. Election disinformation is forcing election officials to hire help or make time for responding to inaccurate information about their election process. False claims have driven protesters to rally outside vote counting centers and to patrol drop boxes. Claims have fueled death threats against election workers and their families, requiring extra security. On top of that, many election offices are understaffed and underfunded. Perpetual claims of voter fraud undermine the public confidence in our elections and threaten to destabilize our democracy. Disinformation continues to flow right here in Colorado. In the headline, it says election denials raising worries. And in the subheading, GOP board members in a handful of counties have not signed off on tallies. And in the first paragraph, Colorado election officials from both major parties say a typically innocuous step in the certification of vote totals has increasingly been seized by activists to cast doubt over state elections. Now, according to the Brennan Center for Justice, this practice appears to be part of a growing election deniers playbook, as the refusal to certify local elections is showing up in a number of states. The belief in a fraudulent election continues that it's having a real-world impact. Obviously, what happened on January 6th was a significant impact, but the beat goes on in that some of the frustrated citizens have been threatening, harassing, abusing our election workers. Here's a video that explains what is happening.
The ripple effects from President Trump's accusations of voter fraud in the 2020 presidential election are still being felt today. Our PBS NewsHour NPR Marist poll this week found that more than 4 in 5 American adults believe the future of American democracy is under serious threat. And several local and state workers who administer elections throughout the country continue to receive personal threats. Stephanie Sy will have our look at what consequences may result from that. But first, we hear from election officials who shared with us what they've been experiencing.
I am Joseph Kirk. I'm the election supervisor in Garfield County, Georgia.
I'm Natalie Adona. I'm the Assistant County Clerk Recorder for the County of Nevada, California.
I am Claire Woodall-Vogue, the Executive Director of the City of Milwaukee Election Commission.
My name is Michelle Carew. I'm the outgoing elections administrator for Hood County, Texas. I have been working in elections for 14 plus years. While attending the Election Commission meeting back in July, it was a 2-hour long meeting. The public was allowed to come in and speak and talk about things that they felt like I was not doing correctly as an elections administrator. They questioned my integrity as an elections administrator.
There is no election integrity because she hasn't done her due diligence to make sure she has a good working relationship with the Republican Party.
I had a phone call after the 2020 presidential election, before the January runoff, from someone from a different state who called to inform me how horrible of a person I was, how, I was letting the country down because she wasn't happy with the results of the election in a county that her candidate won by a large margin.
In the course of several days, I ended up receiving over 150 threats, many of which were death threats, many of which called me some pretty heinous words, and also had voicemails telling me I deserved to go before a firing squad.
I also had, some voters on the phone who were not so kind. And the one that sort of stands out in my mind in particular had been upset because California's identification law does not require us to ask voters for photo ID all of the time. He was upset that I followed the law. And when I told him that, my job is to follow the laws and, here are all the safeguards that are in place for us to identify any voter fraud, he lost his temper with me. He told me that, the Nazis also followed the laws blindly, and how could I live with myself? That was really hard to hear.
So I've had a lot of people ask me, like, Michelle, why are you leaving? Why now? And my answer is, I just don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be a part of these unfounded truths, these constant lies, the constant scrutiny.
I'm a mother of 2 small children. It definitely scared my husband, scares my parents. But I truly love my job, and I have to just push forward because it is a field that I love. And some part of me thinks that the intention of these threats is to get election officials to leave their jobs.
After the January election, I was having panic attacks in the morning. Maybe not for months, but definitely for a couple of months, because I'd been under such pressure for such a long time that coming out the other side of it almost didn't even feel real. And then going back into this election cycle, I was nervous.
We want to be able to give voters the information that they need, and also to give our staff maybe a little bit more assurance that we are doing everything that we can to help protect them.
We've improved security in our office so that all of our staff feel safe coming to work, myself included.
For the first time, I'm including things like poll worker safety in training sessions, or reaching out in a different way to local law enforcement to make sure we have the resources we need and protection we need if we need it.
We don't want any type of applause. We are not looking for that. We just want people to know your vote counted. It was counted fairly. Your vote was cast, and you were represented well.
Those are just a few of the election officials around the country facing verbal attacks and even death threats from fellow Americans, either unhappy with election results, claiming fraud, in all cases questioning the integrity of these public servants. Joining me now to discuss this more is Tammy Patrick, Senior Advisor for the Democracy Fund's Elections Program. She is also a former official in the Elections Department of Maricopa County, Arizona. Ms. Patrick, thank you so much, as always, always, for joining the NewsHour. You heard it, voicemails, text messages where people are threatening election officials' lives, even their children's lives. It seems beyond the pale. Is this something you ever experienced as an election official?
Well, happy election day. And thankfully, it wasn't something that I experienced in my more than a decade of being a local election official. But I will tell you that this is something I've been hearing more and more frequently in the last 6, 7, 8, 9 months. And far too often, we're getting targeted of the election officials that conducted that election freely and fairly. And this is absolutely exemplary of what I'm hearing from all across the country, in places where the former president won, in places where the current president won.
You're hearing about election officials of all levels, either quitting or retiring out of just these threats, worrying them and their families. What do you worry will be the consequence of that?
So vacancies in and of themselves are pretty common. However, we're seeing a systemic rise in the number of vacancies because people are retiring early. They're leaving the job that they love because of the pressure and the mental toll that it's taking on them. This can cause a problem because of a loss of both institutional knowledge for professionals. And then we also have the double problem in this moment of election professionals being replaced by partisan actors. So individuals that will be filling those vacancies with ulterior motives in mind.
And the subtext of what you're saying there, Tammy, is that those partisan actors may actually have integrity issues. So what are the solutions? There have been attempts by Democratic lawmakers in particular to pass legislation that would increase protections for election workers. The Department of Justice has formed a task force. Is any of that going to work to stop these threats?
It's going to take all of us. It's going to take accountability all throughout the system. So whether it's the federal government having task forces to hold people accountable in this moment, or bar associations holding lawyers accountable, or voters holding their own elected representatives accountable at the ballot box, it's going to take all of us to make sure that we get our democracy back on track. As we go into today's election, we know that there are many local races that are up for grabs today, as it were. And as we move into 2022, there are even more local elections that will be held. So secretaries of state that are running on platforms that the 2020 election was illegitimate or stolen need to be held accountable.
Well, it is election day, Tammy, as you mentioned, and there's this close governor's race in Virginia where the Republican candidate there has brought up election integrity, so to speak. Do you see today in that race as a test or a harbinger of what may be coming in the midterms next year, or even the presidential election after that in 2024?
All of the elections that we've seen so far this year, including the California recall election, are all giving us an indication of what to expect in the future. So we've seen candidates both in California and in Virginia calling into question the legitimacy of an election if they were to lose. Now, that is not only playing out at the state level, statewide, but we're seeing that narrative also be used by candidates in local races. So calling into question the ability for anyone to fairly lose an election.
Tammy Patrick with the Democracy Fund, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
This video was from 2021, and not much has changed. A Brennan Center for Justice survey of local election officials in March of this year showed that nearly 1 in 3 have faced harassment, abuse, or threats for simply doing their job. 45% expressed concern for the physical safety of their coworkers in future elections, and 1 in 5 reported they personally feared being physically assaulted on the job. Predictably, this fear has contributed to the exodus among experienced election officials. At least 20% said they plan to leave by 2024. Here was what was reported in Colorado last fall. In the headline, turnover in election office is nears 40% in state. And then in the small print, more than a third of Colorado's local election officials have left their jobs in the last 3 years thanks to term limits and harassment-fueled fatigue, sparking concerns ahead of next fall's presidential contest. Rolling Stone magazine recently reported that our very own Secretary of State has experienced a 600% increase in threats to her and her family since the recent Colorado suit to disqualify Donald Trump from the ballot. While Secretary Griswold says she will not be intimidated, this kind of environment drives out good people and many discourage others from running for office. When experienced election officials are driven from office, that loss of expertise is likely to increase the risk of rookie errors that result in more people doubting the process. The good news is that the Justice Department is attempting to hold accountable those who threaten election officials. However, it is not easy. The department's Election Threats Task Force was created in 2021 and has reviewed more than 2,000 reports of threats and harassment across the country since its inception. But so far, the task force has brought 14 prosecutions and obtained 9 convictions. Most of those reports have not brought charges because of the high bar set by the Supreme Court for prosecution. Communication must be a, quote, true threat, one that crosses the line from free speech to a serious intent to hurt someone. A second and more intimate problem is that some of the people replacing those resigning professionals may be bad faith actors who are inserting themselves into the election process. Not so much to assist in the election process, but to uncover evidence of election fraud. Here in Colorado, we are all aware of Tina Peters, the former clerk of Mercer County, who is awaiting trial on criminal charges for her role in facilitating a security breach of the county's voting machines. Nationally, there have been at least 17 incidents where election-denying employees sought to prove fraud by achieving unauthorized access to voting equipment and data. Another impact is that mainstream candidates for public office are also questioning the legitimacy of our elections. In at least 11 states, a candidate for Secretary of State is someone who has questioned, rejected, or tried to overturn the results of the 2020 election. As you may know, it is the Secretary of State in each state who ensures the smooth and safe administration of American elections. Historically, that job has been far removed from the partisan battles confronting other statewide offices. This seems to have changed with the 2020 election. In 15 states, the nominee for governor is considered an election denier, and in 10 states, the attorney general nominee is. One more impact is that concern about fraudulent elections is popping up among state legislators. They are seeking to pass laws to change the rules surrounding election administration. In 2021, 3 groups focused on supporting democracy issued a report documenting this. Their overall concern is that highly partisan elected office holders were being put in charge of basic decisions about our elections. They identified 148 bills in 36 states making these kinds of changes. Specifically, they saw laws being proposed where legislatures were seeking to control election results. These proposals insert the state legislature into the election certification process, allowing them to change election results after the votes have already been counted. Legislatures were seeking control of election responsibilities. These proposals shift executive power from the Secretary of State to the legislatures. Legislatures were being allowed to meddle in the election minutiae. These proposals allow state legislators to override the judgment of election professionals in the details of managing elections. The legislature would impose criminal or other penalties for election decisions. This means that election administrators could be legally penalized for trying to do their jobs. When trying to administer free and fair elections, inserting partisan players into the mix is an obvious concern. The growth of this election fraud movement has created a possibility that would have seemed unthinkable not so long ago. is it possible that the loser of the next presidential election will not concede or will try to overturn the outcome? I guess we will find out, but this is obviously not a good outcome for democracy. Let's move on to another factor that affects our elections: money. Money affects not only who gets elected, but how politicians behave once in office. Money has always played a role in elections and always held out the possibility of some corrupt impact on our politicians. Our campaign finance laws are attempting to balance the right of citizens to support their candidate by financial contributions while minimizing the possibility of corruption. It is hard to talk about what is happening with money in politics without some understanding of how political campaigns are funded. So hang in there with me as I try to give you an overview. Historically, campaigns were funded by something called political action committees, or PACs, that pooled their financial contributions and donated them to campaigns. There are strict contribution and spending limits associated with PACs. That is how much it can receive from any specific contributor and how much it can dispense on any specific campaign. The Supreme Court has upheld donor limits for direct contributions to campaigns and party committees because the court believed that unlimited contributions could lead to corruption. Additionally, contributions from corporations or labor unions are illegal. When we talk about the laws governing campaign finance, basically we are talking about the laws governing PACs. However, where all the action has been in recent years is a second stream of money in politics called independent expenditure-only PACs that allow corporations, unions, and special interest groups to participate in elections. So a little history on that. Corporations have always been considered a sort of legal artificial person, but the Constitution does not mention corporations or their rights, so it has been up to the courts to determine exactly how they should be treated. In the early years of the Republic, the only right given to corporations was the right to have their contracts respected by the government. Then, with the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, the Supreme Court extended a right of equal protection to ensure that they were treated equally from state to state. Over time, they also extended some of the rights guaranteed to individuals in the Bill of Rights, but not all of them. For example, since at least 1907, corporations have had no right to contribute to political campaigns, nor was there a recognized right to political speech. Then, in 2010, came a Supreme Court case called Citizens United versus the FEC, the FEC being the Federal Elections Commission. The court decided to extend to corporations, including unions and special interest groups, for the first time, full rights to spend money as they wish in federal, state, and local candidate elections, as long as the expenditures were independent of any candidate's campaign. That is, independent of any candidate's PAC. The court said that because speech is an essential mechanism of democracy, the First Amendment forbids discrimination against any class of speaker. It does not matter that some speakers, because of the deepness of their pockets, may have undue influence on the public policy. What is important is that the First Amendment protects both speech and speaker and the ideas that flow from each. It was a very contentious decision and raised many questions. It established the controversial idea that spending money for political campaign purposes is a form of speech protected by the First Amendment. So, is money really the same as speech? Obviously, corporations have more money than the average person. Has the court tilted the playing field away from the average person and toward the corporate viewpoint? Do corporate contributors have a common viewpoint different from the average person that makes this imbalance matter? Are we institutionalizing corporate domination of our electoral process? The court thought protecting speech was so important that it did not matter if certain speakers had an undue influence on our elections or public policy. Is it the court's job to consider the practical effects of their decision? Is it right that corporations are considered people with the same rights as living, breathing people? Were corporations the people our founders had in mind? What if the corporation was formed as a nonprofit to advance specific political views as opposed to the large commercial for-profit corporation? The court made no distinction. 2 months after Citizens United, the DC Circuit Court of Appeals made perfectly clear in a case called Speech Now versus the FEC that as long as a PAC did not contribute directly to a candidate's campaign, they could accept unlimited contributions from individuals, unions, and corporations. Because the political spending was not coordinated with candidates, the courts concluded it could not lead to corruption. The result of the Citizens United and Speech Now decisions was the rise of what are called independent expenditure-only political action committees, or more informally, super PACs. While they could overtly advocate for or against political candidates, they are prohibited from donating money directly to political candidates, and their spending must not be coordinated with that of the candidate. While super PACs had to report their donors to the FEC, essentially there were no limits on either donor contributions or committee expenditures. Now, so far, the FEC has been unable to clearly define what constitutes coordination with a campaign. So the door is open to all sorts of mischief between the campaigns and these independent groups. Frequently, you will see a campaign loyalist leave the campaign in order to start up a super PAC supporting the candidate. The concern about super PACs is that they continue to magnify the political power of a smaller group of very well-off individuals and corporations and continue to diminish the relative power of any one non-wealthy American. There is one more campaign finance organization you need to be aware of. Since Citizens United, there has also been a rise of politically active nonprofit organizations. Under the IRS, a 501c4 is a nonprofit organization that exists to promote a social welfare purpose. While it may engage in some political advocacy, the organization's social welfare mission must be its primary purpose. What makes these nonprofits attractive to campaigns is they are under no legal obligation to disclose their donors, even if they spend to influence elections. When they choose not to reveal their sources of funding, you may hear them referred to as dark money groups. These nonprofits are then able to contribute unlimited amounts of money to the super PACs without the funding being traced back to the original donor. The IRS is not yet investigating whether these nonprofits are overspending on political activity when they are supposed to be primarily social welfare organizations. The organizations seem to be operating as unregulated political committees because the IRS is not setting rules about what percentage of funds these nonprofits may spend on political activity. And we have no visibility into who is contributing to these nonprofit groups because we know they are now outspending super PACs by a wide margin. And as an example of how this can work, a record donation was recently collected by a new nonprofit called the Marble Freedom Trust. A donor gifted all the shares of his company to the nonprofit just before an international conglomerate bought the company for $1.65 billion. Since the sale occurred within the nonprofit, as the owner, the donor avoided about $400 million in taxes, and the nonprofit now has some extra pocket change for their social welfare work, which the Marble Freedom Trust describes as to maintain and expand human freedom. This dark money approach has been enthusiastically adopted by both Democrats and Republicans. Democrats seem to oppose dark money, but their affiliated nonprofits outspent Republican ones in the 2020 elections. The idea that a candidate and his or her campaign would raise and spend most of the money in any race seems logical, but it is now these outside groups, these super PACs and these nonprofits, routinely spend far more than candidates and their campaigns. So what is the impact of all this money sloshing around in our system? Is this just lots of free speech, or is there a corrupting effect on our democracy? In this video, Lawrence Lessig, professor of law at Harvard University, makes the case that who runs in an election is less important than who gets nominated to run in the first place. There is a money primary ahead of the actual primaries that determines who gets to run, and whoever then gets elected will be responsive to those with the money.
So it turns out exactly a year ago, right now, right this minute, a year ago in Hong Kong, an extraordinary protest began. Protest begun by students, literally high school and college students, elementary school students. Then their parents felt a little embarrassed that they had let the kids work so hard. The parents showed up as well. And the protest was about a law. And the law was proposed by China. The law was to determine how the governor of Hong Kong would be selected. And the law said the ultimate aim was the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. Okay, so the idea was there's a two-step process. The first step was nomination, and then the second step was an election. And the nominating committee would be comprised of about 1,200 people, which means out of 7 million people, that is 0.02% of Hong Kong. All right, now 0.02%, as you can see, is a really tiny number, right? Really, really small. If you thought about it relative to all the people in Hong Kong, it would look something like this. This tiny little corner is 0.02%. So 0.02% get to pick the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong gets to vote among. And the protest was because the fear was this filter would be a biased filter. The claim was that the 0.02% would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. So 99.98% would be excluded from this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to China only. Okay, now it turns out the Chinese stole this idea from America. Don't worry, there was no patent or copyright, so there's no IP violations going on here, but they stole the idea from an American, maybe the greatest political philosopher in America, a man named Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed, the head of the Tammany Hall political party, used to say, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. So this conception, this kind of conception of politics has an obvious logic to it, right? Because if you control the nomination, every candidate is going to worry what you, the nominator, think. So you practically control the candidate, whether or not you control the ultimate election. We can call that genius theory for destroying democracy, Tweedism. Tweedism. Any two-stage process where the Tweeds get to nominate and then the rest get to select is Tweedism, and the consequence of Tweedism, obviously, is to produce a system responsive to Tweeds only. Now, Tweedism was practiced not just in the North, not just in New York, it was practiced in the South too. Texas, 1923, practiced Tweedism. By law, in 1923, Texas passed a statute that said, in the Democratic primary, only whites could vote. Only whites could vote. Blacks could vote in the general election if, of course, they could get registered, given all the barriers to registration, but only whites could vote in the Democratic primary. And of course, back then, hard to imagine, but back then, the only party that mattered was the Democratic Party in Texas. So in this two-stage process, Blacks were excluded from the first stage, 16% of Texas excluded from this critical first stage, with the consequence obviously producing a democracy responsive to whites only. Now, those cases are obvious to us. Everyone looks at that and says, there's something obviously wrong with those so-called democracies to set up their structure in that way. So why don't we see it here? We take it for granted in the United States that campaigns will be privately funded. But we need to recognize funding is its own contest. Funding is its own primary. We have the voting system where people vote, but in the first stage to that, there is a money primary that determines which candidates are allowed to run in those voting elections. Now, that money primary takes time. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars. This is an old telephone, you might not recognize this, but dialing for dollars, calling people all across the country to get the money they need to run their campaigns or to get their party back into power. B.F. Skinner gave us this wonderful image of the Skinner box, where any stupid animal could learn which buttons it needed to push for its sustenance. This is a picture of the life of the modern American congressperson. As the modern American congressperson comes to learn which buttons he or she needs to push to get the sustenance he or she needs to make his or her campaign successful. This is their life, and it has an effect. Each of them, as they do this, develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shape-shifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money, not on issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000. Leslie Byrne, a Democrat from Virginia, describes that when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. And to clarify, she went on, you know, he was not an environmentalist. So this obviously is a primary too. It's the money primary. It's not a white primary, it's the green primary. It's the first stage in a multi-stage process to select the candidates who will represent us. So if this is the structure, we should interrogate who are the funders. Well, we can think about who the biggest funders are. In 2014, the top 100 gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million funders to congressional campaigns. In this election cycle so far, 400 families have given half the money in the election contributions and contributions to super PACs so far. 400 families. That's not American democracy. That is banana republic democracy. And then we can think not just about the biggest funders, but think about the relevant funders. Of course, the people giving millions of dollars have the attention of the members of Congress. But how much do you need to give to be relevant? How much you need to give to matter to those Congress people as they're dialing for dollars to raise money from you? Well, let's take the people who maxed out in 2014. And in 2014, that means you gave $5,200 to at least one candidate in the general primary and in the general election. 2014, it turns out 57,874 Americans maxed out in that way. So we could say 57,874 gave enough to matter, to control, to be the dominant force in this first stage of the election process. And then some of you out there, the math of geniuses out there, beginning to do the numbers, you're thinking 57,874? Wait a minute. That's 0.02% of America. 0.02% of America dominate this first stage in the process of electing the candidates who will represent us. They pick the candidates, because you can't be credible unless you get their money, and we get to vote for those candidates. This tiny fraction of the 1%, this Chinese fraction of the 1%, dominate this first stage with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to these funders only. This Princeton study, which is a Harvard professor, I'm not allowed to talk about much, so let's get it off the stage quick, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page, the largest empirical study of actual decisions by our government in the history of political science, related the actual decisions of our government over the past 40 years with the views of the economic elite, the views of organized interest groups, and the views of the average voter. And what they found was there was a nice correlation between the views of the economic elite and what our government actually did. So as you go from 0% of the elite supporting something to 100%, the probability of that proposal being passed goes up. Same thing with organized special interest groups. As the number of them supports something increases, the probability of that proposal being passed goes up. Here's the graph for the average voter. It's a flat line. Flat line, literally and figuratively. What this is saying is, as the percentage of average voters supporting a proposal goes from 0 to 100%, it doesn't change the probability that that proposal will be enacted. As they put in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy. This is true. Right, so here's the picture that we were told of our democracy. There we were, citizens driving the bus. But here's the reality. The reality is, the steering wheel has become detached from this bus. We don't drive the bus anymore. We do not anecdotally, in the most aggressive empirical analysis, have no relationship to what our government does. This is a product of tweedism. Tweedism. And what tweedism is first corruption. It's a corruption of the design of our representative democracy. When Madison gave us our representative democracy, he described it in Federalist 52 to be a system that would have a branch, Congress, that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone, an exclusive dependence. But that's not our Congress. They're dependent on the people and dependent on the Tweeds. And then to go on, to clarify, Madison in Federalist 57 said, by the people, he means, quote, not the rich more than the poor. Not the rich more than the poor. But that's not our reality. The people today mean not the rich more than the poor, except for the Tweeds. The Tweeds have more power than the middle class and the poor. This is corruption. It's not criminals. It's a system in which decent people who come to this city to do the right thing find themselves bent to do the thing the Tweeds demand, because that's the only way you can survive.
This ends our discussion of money, and this is where we will end for today. Place your 4x6 cards in the envelope at the back of the room, and we will see you next week.